as a planning historian, I was interested in the impact of this project on London, and also I was interested in the history of the project. So I want to do the two things. I want to talk about Crossrail and its significance for spatial planning in London, and I also want to tell you a little bit about the long time it has taken us to build this railway across London and look at the history of the project itself. So, if we start from thinking about the spatial structure of London, London isn't like Sydney, it's not like Toronto, it's not like New York, it's not like Amsterdam, it's not a waterfront city. It has a river, but its pattern of growth historically has been isotropic. It's tended to grow in all directions. It's radially symmetrical. But that structure conceals a deep historic internal asymmetry, non-symmetry between East and West. I express this by finding a wonderful quotation from a novelist, Jack London, writing in 1902 in his novel People of the Abyss, when he writes to the travel agents, Thomas Cook and Son. And he says, "Oh, Thomas Cook and Son, pathfinders and trail cleavers, who would unhesitatingly and instantly, with ease and celerity, send me to darkest Africa or innermost Tibet, but to the East End of London, barely a stone's throw distant from Ludgate Circus, you know not the way." And this is a very interesting aspect of London, is that the East End, with its docks and its industry, was a relatively closed and separate part of London. And that was expressed in the planning. I mean, you see the famous planning map of Abercrombie, in which he mapped the spatial structure of London, and the contrast between the darkness of the East End and the brilliance of the West End is very clear. And then if we look at all the data of the structure of London, for example, here we've got travel to work flows in 1954. So we can see how clearly the structure of London is asymmetrical between East and West. The entirely separate labour market, effectively, of the East End from that of the West End. And we see it if we look at the map of tenure. Here we're looking at council ownership as against owner-occupation or private rented housing. We see it in the map of educational attainment. It's probably not showing up very well. That's actually the area east of the City of London is all red, the rest is all grey. We see it in the map of voting behaviour, political control. The East was a separate political sphere dominated by the Workers' Party, the Labour Party. It was, when I started writing about London, and I started writing about London in the early 1970s, it was very interesting that the taxi drivers in London, taxi drivers famously have to learn all the streets of London. It's called the knowledge. And the knowledge then didn't include any destinations in the East End of London. So my book on London, which I published, London More by Fortune Than Design, which is a book about spatial planning, this is the start of chapter 1 of that book, pointing out that taxi drivers in London never had to learn about the East. And this was the book which taxi drivers were tested on to test their knowledge of all the streets of London. And we see that there were hardly any destinations in the East. The East was a separate world. Nobody would catch a taxi to the East End of London. And this was when I was at the London School of Economics. We're talking about the 1970s here. Still, the separation of the East was a very striking feature. And that was reflected in the map of employment. If we come on to talk about policy and planning, we see that the east of London, with the decline of the docks, the changing pattern of the port activity, something which we're very familiar with here in Holland, containerisation, the death of the old upstream ports. In London, that produced a pattern not simply of separation, but of chronic economic disparity with very concentrated unemployment. This is the map of unemployment as it was in 1981. And the initial spatial planning response in London was to try to revive the manufacturing, the manual, the blue-collar basis of work. It had always been a blue-collar district, so therefore the challenge for policy was to bring new industrial employment into the East End. So the East End went on being separate. This was the Greater London Development Plan. Here we see how the policymakers in the London Metropolitan Council were trying to designate the whole of the docks as an industrial area. And that policy was pursued really right up until the mid-1980s with very little success. Industry didn't want to move into inner London. It was difficult to get to. The pattern of accessibility was inconvenient. The sites were small, they were fragmented. And besides, the area had a reputation for decline and stagnation. And so the landscape of East London was a landscape of dereliction, of empty sites, of corrugated iron. And that was the case, a tension between policy and accomplishment, until the time of Mrs. Thatcher, and particularly under Mrs. Thatcher, the designation of the enterprise zone, and particularly this character, who was a banker and an antiquarian, had a very interesting CV, and it was he who came to the derelict spaces of the east of London and said, we should break this dichotomy between the east and west. We should make this a central business district. This is where we should put the floor space that the financial centre of London requires to compete in the global economy of the late 20th century. This was a radically different perspective on the spatial possibilities of East London. And then the story we all know very well. It was a story that led to the development of Canary Wharf and the Olympics and the emergence of a radically different pattern of economic activity in London, and following that, a radically different spatial structure of London, a balancing up of East London cool and West London chic. So East London now has a very, very different profile and a far greater sense of integration with the West. It's different, but it's part of a single dynamic metropolitan centre. Okay, so that's my preamble. Now what I want to talk about is the transport implications of this, the history of the remodelling of London transport, to reflect this spatial rebalancing, this new equilibrium between West London chic and East London cool. So very different from the division of labour that Abercrombie envisaged in his plan, or the GLC envisaged in its. Now, first of all, just by background, let's quickly look at the sequence of underground maps, the famous, iconic map of the London Underground. Every visitor to London has it, every Londoner carries it in the back of their diary or in their mobile phone, because you live by this map. So this was the original version, 1934. And the interesting thing was, you see, there was nothing east of the Tower. There was nothing at all. There was the one dock railway in red there, and there was the green district line heading out to the eastern suburbs. But essentially, the underground map reflected the cabbie's knowledge. Everything was to the west of the Tower of London. And then we see, as we look at successive iterations of the underground map, how the network developed in the East and has continued to develop in the East up to the present day, where now we're looking at an enormous rail investment, which is Crossrail, which is this new railway line which is running from the Heathrow Airport as a mainline railway right the way through the centre and out the other side to Kent and Essex. And that's the railway line that I was involved in a very small way, chairing the design review panel for the stations. And that's the railway I want to talk about. And I want to talk about it historically because it's a very interesting history. Here's the Crossrail tunnel, an enormous excavation. This is not a small railway. It's a railway running trains which are 1/4 of a kilometre long, running them at 4-minute head times. It's a single investment which is going to increase London's rail capacity by 10%. An £18 billion sterling, a 25 billion euro project, the biggest construction project in Britain at present. So this is, in terms of the spatial planning of London, an enormous intervention. It's not a new idea. My last paper on Crossrail, which you can find in Town Planning Review, was an attempt to show the spatial planning history of this project. And it's a spatial planning history that goes right back to the earliest stages of the building of railways in London, back to the 1830s, when London's railways first took shape. And they took shape as a ring of terminal stations around the edge of London. So what you're seeing there is a series of railways coming from all the points of the compass, from north and south and east and west, and they all stopped at the edge of the built-up area. And then all the way through the 19th century, there was a big discussion how to join the dots. Should we build a Hauptbahnhof? Should we bring the railways together into a new grand central station for London, as was done in many continental cities? Or should we, which in fact we did, join them with an underground circular line, the district line, the circle line, which, with a change to an underground railway, provides connectivity between the termini. But the notion of directly connecting these mainline railways across London is an old one. And it's interesting, the original stimulus was quite unexpected. The stimulus was a visual one, a concern about the visual impact of the bridges across the River Thames. So here we've got one of the famous French Impressionist pictures of London, André Derain, and his view of the embankment. And obviously he, as an Impressionist artist, was seeing beauty in the railway bridges. But if we look at the debate in London, the London Fine Arts Society, the London Society, they saw nothing but ugliness. And so the original ideas for connecting underground across London, the object was to substitute for the bridges, so that the bridges could be taken away as these blemishes on the fair face of London. Interesting reminder of the power of the aesthetic argument. And that is what we still find in the famous plan by my successor as predecessor as Professor of Town Planning at the Bartlett School, Professor Sir Patrick Abercrombie, in his famous plan for London in 1943, prepared during the war. He proposed railway tunnels under London connecting the mainline railway stations. And the main impetus for those was not a transport engineering or a sort of optimization of travel flows. It was for the physical replanning of the areas and for the elimination of the ugly cast iron bridges that spoilt the view of St. Paul's and the brick viaducts, which all of you have visited London will remember these brick viaducts which take the railway lines in, past the cathedrals and lead to the railway stations of Waterloo and Fenchurch Street and Charing Cross and London Bridge and so on, and Liverpool Street. These very distinctive railway viaducts, which Abercrombie's plan proposed to remove and replace with a connected web of tunnels. So the story then continues, and I was very surprised because this story had never been written, and it's been great fun writing the story of London's proposals. Abercrombie plan didn't go into a lot of detail. That was left to the London Railway Plans Committee, 1949, which proposed a very comprehensive series of connections between the main line, the 12 mainline railway terminal stations. So you could travel directly from one suburb underneath London and come out at the other end. But that was in the early 1950s. And it's very interesting to see how planners in the 1950s, spatial planning in the 1950s, didn't plan for railways. The plans for London were all about accommodating the motor car. They were like Chinese cities today, Vincent. The assumption was that the motor car rules and that extensive car parking provision and direct access from the motorway grid to downtown destinations was essential. And there's a famous paper which is often quoted by Peter Hall, Transport, the Maker and Breaker of Cities. And every planning student ought to read that. It's in Town Planning Review, 1957. And it's by a very famous statistician, Colin Clark, he of the density distance rule. And Colin Clark, writing in 1957, talks about transport as the maker of cities, the maker of the 19th century high-density city, and the breaker of that city. And he talks about the inevitable death of the high-density, intense city, and the inevitable triumph of the motor car, and the inevitable dispersal of cities. And that's why planners didn't really bother to modernise the railway network of London. And that's why subsequent attempts by transport engineers, such as this transport study in 1968, failed. They failed because at the same time the Buchanan report was proposing to build a motorway network into London, and the motorways were the ones that got incorporated in policy. The railways hit the trash can. They were never progressed. But the story then takes an interesting twist in London, because in London there was a political upsurge. The citizens of London refused to let the authorities build a motorway grid. The 1972 local government elections elected a metropolitan authority, a council, on a no motorways ticket. So London never completed its motorway grid. It never built its highway network. And so, for that reason, the proposal for Crossrail came back onto the agenda. And here's the form that it took in the London Rail Study of 1974 and British Railways Plan of 1980. So here, once again, we have serious attempts to think of how London could be articulated as an immense capital city of a metropolitan region of, as it then was, 10 million people, with a U-Bahn of the sort that was already being built in Paris and Berlin and other cities, in which mainline trains would come into the city and out the other side, a regional express link. And what happened this time? Well, as we know, what happened was Mrs. Thatcher and the election of Mrs. Thatcher in 1979 and the decision of the British government to completely abandon any investment in rail. And so, once again, the idea was there, the preliminary designs were there. The transport engineers were already thinking about Crossrail, but the policy context was not ripe. It comes back again in the 1980s. So now we're talking about the late 1980s. We're talking about an extraordinary period in London's history after the Big Bang, after the arrival of Canary Wharf, after financial globalization. London has emerged as the financial capital of Europe and head of the euro-dollar market and the main global financial trading node in the European time zone. And so there is a tremendous demand for large floor plate office buildings. Canary Wharf is already beginning to grow. And London does not have a motorway network. It has a declining and a congested rail network. And so, again, policymakers start to think, now, how can we tackle this? And the idea of a crossrail makes its appearance. And it first makes its appearance at a time when Mrs. Thatcher has abolished the Metropolitan Authority and London is being governed, this is an extraordinary period, by 33 separate municipalities. London is being planned by a federal body made up of 33 separate boroughs in an advisory committee called LPAC. And they commission a rail study. And here we've got various options done by Colin Buchanan and partners, options for Crossrail, east-west options and north-south options. And this leads to a revised proposal for Crossrail, which is accepted by the government, the Department of Transport, 1989, in its Central London Rail Study. And it leads to legislation, the Crossrail Bill, 1993. And the Crossrail Bill goes to Parliament and it is voted out by MPs. It's a very interesting case. It reached the Legislative Assembly and it was voted out by MPs because there was too much disruption, because they shouldn't be spending so much money at the expense of the rest of the nation. The case was not made. The design was imperfect. There was too much disruption. They hadn't thought about the complexity of building underground railways under such a large and complex city as London. So that was the end of the story, yet again, until the millennium and until the return of a Labour government. And the Labour government of Tony Blair, one of the first things it did was pass the London Government Act, which restored a metropolitan authority to London. So the intersection of politics, planning, and transport here is very fascinating. I'm shortening the story because I want to finish off. But there's no doubt that it would not have happened had not the Labour government, coming in 1997, passed a law which re-established a London-wide metropolitan authority for the built-up area of London with a directly elected mayor. And the directly elected mayor, with a headquarters building which was deliberately small, designed by Norman Foster, a funny-looking building like a collapsing pile of plates, but it was designed so that you couldn't extend it. So it was designed for a mayor who would only have a small staff, who would not have a bureaucracy of 2,000 people, but who would have a tight, strategic team with a span of control over all the strategic functions of London: transport, public health, environment, housing. And so the mayor was elected, and one of the first things that the mayor did was revive this plan which had so often been proposed and so often postponed and abandoned, and now it returned. And it returned with a design team who were partly the ones who'd done it before, but this time it was the team who had built the Hong Kong Metro. And they just finished. A lot of the same designers, the same engineers, came from Hong Kong, and they built the Jubilee Line extension to Canary Wharf, which for any of you who are architects is the most fantastic piece of railway station and railway design anywhere in Europe. Each station was designed by an individual architect, and they are like cathedrals. They're wonderful, wonderful stations. And this team then came on and was set to work on, to deliver the Crossrail project. And the partnership of Crossrail was inaugurated, and the spatial planning framework, because here we're talking about spatial planning in a spatial planning seminar, so the spatial plan for London began to incorporate exactly this thinking. London would grow on an east-west axis, and so part of the logic of Crossrail, its economic justification, was it would open up improved connectivity, rebalancing that historic disequilibrium between east and west. So it was the main growth corridor going down into the Thames Gateway. So the story is approaching, is it not, dear friends, a happy ending. Here we have the new mayor of London, Boris Johnson, still the mayor, who succeeded Ken Livingstone, the first mayor of London. And here he is looking at the fantastic physical scale model of London in Canary Wharf with a line of Crossrail blinking in blue lights across the city. And here we've got the Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, behind him. And the financial crash happened almost at the same time, 2008 to 2009. Global financial crisis. All capital works were put back into the melting pot. Crossrail was a very strong candidate for scrapping. Why should we spend 15 billion, rising to 17 billion pounds, in London, which had just had the Olympics, which had just had the Jubilee Line extension? What sort of spatial planning sense did that make to invest so much more in the already overheated southeast? So, Crossrail, the story seemed to be at an end. Most people thought Crossrail would never happen. And this was a very nice private eye cartoon, Crossrail in jeopardy again. It's costing £16 billion to collect Heathrow with some dump out east. Barking, it's a very English joke, barking mad, completely. I'm sticking with a helicopter. Do you get the joke? Well, okay, so amazingly, Boris Johnson managed to persuade the government to issue the contracts. So the tunnelling contracts went out early in late in 2011. And that was when I started to be involved with the project. It went through Parliament, the hybrid phase. By February 14, it was halfway there. This badge was given me by one of our doctoral students. She's Spanish. Her husband is one of the many Spaniards, because the mayor of, any Spanish here? Because Spain was the capital of tunnelling, because the mayor of Madrid, he bought 6 tunnel boring machines, and he made an amazing tunnelling project. He built a new metro line, the Ligne A out to the southwest of the town, and he also tunnelled an entirely new ring road round Madrid. within his 5-year terms. Fantastic. So Spain has got the most fantastic number of tunnelling engineers. So all the guys in our street who are checking the vibration meters to see how much our houses are being affected by the tunnel which goes under our house, they're all wearing orange overalls and talking Spanish. But at any rate, the tunnelling is now complete. They're laying the railway tracks. And there is no doubt that Crossrail, when it opens, only 3 years away now, 2 years away, is going to completely transform the geography of East and West London. This is going to be the single biggest transport infrastructure that's going into parts of London that were always historically deprived of infrastructure, had poor accessibility, were cheap or accessible, and were underdeveloped for that reason. So in planning terms, it's going to create pressures of a very, very interesting sort. Now, the precedent for this is very interesting. We know how fast east-west or north-south crossrails can transform geography. We know because we've seen it in Paris. Remember, who's French here? But we all know Paris. And we all know how the RER, opening 1976, 40 years ago, transformed the geography of Paris, the Ville Nouvelle, to the north, to the east, to the west, to the south, completely transformed the geography of Paris. And now the Grand Paris is a new phase of Parisian infrastructure-led spatial planning with a new orbital railway which goes around the outside of Paris. So London, maybe by 2050, will be also developing new high-speed, high-frequency, high-intensity orbital lines. But now, for now, we're building London's first RER. And yesterday, I was here for the inaugural lecture of Carola Hein, Professor Hein, who's my great colleague on the journal Planning Perspectives. And so at the dinner table, I was sitting beside her boss. And her boss is Dick van Haneren. And it's very interesting. So he now is working, Meccano is working on a project which is only possible because of Crossrail. So Thamesmead is a failed council estate on a munitions base in the southwest of London, in a very low-density suburban area. And Crossrail stops at Abbey Wood Station. And Abbey Wood Station is a very low-density suburban station in which nothing is happening. Low-density houses with gardens, people walking to work, a shopping precinct with 4 shops in it. This is going to be the terminal point for this mega project with trains arriving direct from Heathrow every 4 minutes. So this is staggering, the impact. And Meccano has been brought in to redevelop the area. And it's a very, very interesting project. So now they're building high density in the municipality, which says no towers here. We're a suburban area. And so Professor Hanrahan is having to explain to them the spatial planning implications of this rail infrastructure, which for them is still largely invisible. It hasn't happened yet. How can they imagine what is going to hit them? So a very, very interesting story, which I thought I'd share with you today. Thank you.